Hi everyone and welcome to Stamp Nation Masterclass. My name is Ilina and I'm here with Casual Fridays. And the focus on this masterclass is cards with Sass. So I'm focusing on sentiments being the focus point of my cards, and I will show you a few different ways how to use sentiments as focal point and add some sass to your cards while doing it. So in the first couple cards, I'll be using some watercolor paper. So let's start with the first one. I'm using Archie's cold press watercolor paper, and this is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'll trim it at the end again, and I will stamp my sentiment, and I'm using, this is the Sassy Smile stamp set. So I'm using this big smile sentiment along with one of the coordinating sentiments that goes along with it. So I'm positioning that onto my watercolor paper, and I'll be using my Misty stamping tool to stamp it. So here I'm using the grid, transparency grid, in order to make sure that I have the sentiment stamped straight, because I'm notorious for stamping my sentiments crooked. So this kind of helps me to position that sentiment and to be perfectly lined up. So making sure everything is straight and parallel to each other, because I'm using two separate stamps. So I think that looks pretty good. And I'll just pick the stamps with the lid of the Misty. And then I'll stamp with black ink and then emboss with black embossing powder. I want that sentiment to stand out and be really kind of intense black. So before I go on to stamping, I am preparing my watercolor paper with the stamp body, emboss body actually. So because I'm embossing with black embossing powder, and then I'll do some watercoloring on top so I don't have all those black speckles and I don't get emboss resist where I don't want to be. So I'm inking my stamp with black ink. So I'm just making sure that it's, because the sentiment is pretty bold, so I want to make sure that it's nicely covered with that ink, and I'm stamping a few times to get that very intense black. And you may ask why I'm not stamping it with Versamark when I'm embossing with black embossing powder. It is because I want as well to be like the black, even if somewhere it's not stamped or dries by the time I emboss it. So I have nice coverage. So I don't have some spots that are white under the embossing powder. So I'm just stamping that probably a handful of times to get that nice coverage. So I think that is pretty good. So now I'll just remove my watercolor paper from the Misty and sprinkle some of the black embossing powder. I'm using the fine embossing powder, which gives pretty nice detail when embossed. So I'm just gonna flick the excess off, kind of flick it pretty good, so you don't end up with those speckles onto your watercolor paper. Or if you use any other paper, just make sure that you kind of flick it nicely. And then I'm going with brush. This is actually makeup brush that I have lying around. It's pretty nice for embossing powder. You can use any kind of brush. I just don't really use makeup brushes, so I kind of repurposed my makeup brush. Next, I'm just heat setting it with embossing gun. And next, I'll just tape this piece of watercolor paper onto some wood board. So when I'm applying water to it, the watercolor paper doesn't wrinkle. So I have it nice and flat, and as well, it's nicer after that when you adhere that onto your card base. So I'm using some frog tape. This is for delicate surfaces, so when I remove it, it doesn't rip my watercolor paper. You can use either painter's tape or washi tape, but I found out that the washi tape doesn't really hold the watercolor paper that nice. Next, I'm applying some clean water over the sentiment, kind of to get that splatter look. So I'm just applying randomly water, making sure that the sentiment is covered. And then I have my craft sheet, my Teflon craft sheet on the left side. You can see it there. I'll be using it as a palette where I'll apply ink from the ink pad. So I have a handful of ink pads, and first I'm starting with the lightest one, Tiara, which is yellow. So next I'm using different paintbrush to pick up some of the ink. This is a Catherine Puller Tiara ink. And the inks are very reactive with water, and they're very rich and very kind of bold, and after they dry they keep the brightness. It's just wonderful. So I'm just adding that, and the water helps to spread the ink, kind of create flow of that ink. So I'm here gonna create some sort of rainbow, so that's why I'm starting from the yellow. Then I'll go with orange and then pink. Next I'm using Tiki Torch. So I'll apply next to the yellow, and because it was my cardstock was not cardstock, watercolor paper was already wet, those colors kind of run into each other and blend at the where they meet. So next I'm using Princess Dress, and I'm applying some more next to the orange. So you saw me before I applied the Princess Dress, I added more water because it's gonna start drying. Next I'm using Fiesta, and that's like very nice turquoise. And next I'm using the green one. Right now I'm blanking out of the name. So I'm going back with, I'll have listed all the colors that I used in the description. So next I went back and added some more yellow to get a little bit darker yellow, and I'm just, because I was impatient, I decided to heat set this to dry faster. So I set it aside to continue drying, and here I'm moving to a second card. Well, I use different technique. Again, using the ink pads as for watercoloring, but this time I'm using my, I'll apply the ink onto my acrylic block, then spray it with water, and stamp it onto my cardstock. So I have Garden Party, I have Melon Ice and Aquatini. So I'm starting with the medium color. So I'm applying that in the middle of my acrylic block, and then on the bottom and the top I'll apply the lighter and the darker from the colors. So I'm just applying that, trying to make sure that I don't mix, kind of contaminate my ink pad, especially the lighter one, the Melon Ice. So I have that covered. Next I'm using just spray bottle full with water, sprayed like 5 times. And then I'm applying my watercolor paper on top and waiting about 10 to 15 seconds. And this is Tortimore 500 series watercolor paper. It comes with in 5x7 panels. So now I'm done. And then I have some water, like there, kind of more watery ink, which I picked up with paper towel. Next I'll heat set this so I can continue working, or you can just let it dry if you have time to wait. But usually I'm impatient to finish my project, so I just heat set. Next I'm using the Friend Fry die. So I'm trying to position it in the middle because I'll add as well sentiment on the bottom. So I'm just trying to see how high up I would like to put that Friend die cut. So I'm just trying to see how the positioning will go. I decided to move it a little bit up, and next I'm securing that to the watercolor paper using some washi tape. And then I have a piece of black fan foam, and I will die cut that die from the foam as well. So by the magic of TV, I have everything die cut here. And make sure that you have saved the pieces that go like inside of the E and the D and the F, because we'll be adding those at the end too. So the next step is to pop this this die cut onto the foam die cut. to get that more dimension and raised image. Because I'm using black card base, that's why I decided to do the black fun foam instead of white. So next I'm using Ranger matte medium to adhere it, or you can use sticky adhesive like to die cut those, so you can just peel off the backing and don't need to worry about messing with the liquid adhesive. So I'm adhering those together and just let them dry for a little bit. It dries pretty quick, so you don't need to worry about waiting too long for it. So I'm using some microtip applicators. Those are like used for medical or for dental or makeup purposes, but they work perfectly for applying adhesive for like small like die cuts, or even for not rhinestones, but sequins and rhinestones too, and raindrops, etc. So I'm just kind of lining the two layers together. So I think that looks pretty good. And next I just have the dot for the eye. And I'll adhere that on top too. So make sure that it's nice and that stays there. Especially it's difficult for the smaller dies. So now I've already I applied sticky adhesive on the back, and I stamped the sentiment using the Midnight ink pad from Catherine Puller. So here I'm using a black card base. It's like side folding one. It's 5.5 by 8.5, scored in half. Next I'll just, because that's sticky adhesive, I have the sticky adhesive in the back. Makes adhering of these die cuts very fast. So next I'm using the small that I told you to save them, the small pieces that come in between. So I'll just slide those into the little holes of the die cut, so you don't see that the black background from the card base in the back. So it looks nicer and more professional and kind of looks more neat. So I'm using a set of tweezers here in order to do that, because they're pretty tiny, and then I'm pressing it down to make sure that I adhere. So before I remove that backing, I'm going with a bone folder and varnishing that to make sure that everything, that the whole adhesive from the sticky adhesive sheet is on the back of my panel. And next I'm just adhering on that black card base. And to add a little bit more kind of punch to my card, I'm adding some Nouveau black drops. You can use rhinestones, or you can use black pearls or anything, or even black sequins. I think that will work perfectly. So my first card is done. So here's it. So now that, in the meantime, the panel that I had left drying is already done, and it's ready to be put into a card. So by the magic of TV again, I have that cut to 4 by 5.25, and I'm using another black card base, the same size as the previous card. It's 5.5 by 8.5, scored at the 4.25 mark. Next I'm using black fun foam to pop that panel to get a little bit more dimension. And then I'm using some tape adhesive to adhere that together. The perfect one is the Tombow Extreme Adhesive, especially when you're using fun foam for the backing of your cards, but I could not find mine, so this one worked fine too. I think it's the Koyoko one. And next I'm adding some raindrops to add some little bit more interest to my card. So I'm just trying to position them first before I adhere them. So I'm just trying to get the raindrops from that little kind of dish where I keep them. They're very easily accessible instead of opening bags or little containers. They just stay there on my desk, and because I use them a lot. So it's very handy when I'm making a card. They're right there. And again, I'm using the Ranger Multimatte at medium adhesive. So when it dries clear. So you can see it under your raindrops even though they're clear too. So that's now this card is done too. And in a second, we're moving here onto the third and last card. So I'm using the Modern Petals background builder stamp and few ink pads from Catherine Puller. So I'm using the Mega Misty, the Memory Misty, to stamp that background because I'm using different colors and I want everything to be lined up nicely. So I'm just lining up, and on the bottom, like at the bottom corners, I put little dots onto the grid paper to know where the position was. So I positioned that, I centered that nicely, and then picked up my stamp with the lid of the Misty. So when I moved it, because it's a new stamp, it kind of pulled up that piece of Nina White cardstock. So I decided to put it back together because I knew where it went. So first I'm using the Melon Ice to stamp on the bottom. Actually this will be top because I'm starting backwards. I wanted to start from the lighter to the darker ink. So when I'm cleaning my stamp, it's as well easier to stamp. Next step, position that line where it's like the point of the petal with the dot that it was like the corners, and I'm going with Garden Party, the green ink. I'm stamping my second line, so I'm gonna move it again. Kind of position that left petal, like the petal, kind of lining up with that dot where my corners, like the very bottom, were. Next I'm going with Aquatini. Stamping that layer. And I'm going to do it one more time. So I'm just moving it down again. So I'm using the Fleur de Fuchsia for the last layer. Well, not the last layer, but the last part of this background. I decided to go one more time because some parts were not covered. I didn't really cover the stamp nicely. So that's my background. I really like how it came out. So next what I'll do is trim it to 4 by 5.25. I'm going like 1/8 of an inch of all sides. So because it was perfectly centered, I didn't want to mess that positioning. So that's why I'm cutting equal sides, equal amounts from each side. Next I'm gonna stamp the Smile Sentiment from the Sassy Smile stamp set. So I'm positioning that in the center. As said, I started from the lightest on the top as well because the sentiment it will be more visible if it's on a lighter background than compared to the darker, like the purple and the Aquatini. So I'm stamping that with the Midnight ink a few times to get that nice saturated black look. And because I'm using the Misty, I don't really pay attention how well I apply the ink to that sentiment. So next I'll stamp the coordinating sentiment that goes with the smile. But this time I'm not stamping this one directly to my panel, but I'll use some black cardstock to add that little punch and little kind of pop onto my card. I'm going to stamp on black cardstock and then emboss with white embossing powder. So I'm using here the creative corners in order to line that up and it doesn't move. I know the position when in case my little strip moves. Like that. So I know where it goes again. And I'll use some Versamark ink to stamp that sentiment, but before that I will use the embossing body to apply to that strip so I don't have random white spackles around my sentiment. So I'm making sure that it's stamped good, and then I'll just apply the white embossing powder and heat set it. So, and make sure that you flick it again nicely, because this is like kind of contrasting, like the black embossing powder onto the white cards, like watercolor paper. Now it's like the white embossing powder onto black cardstock. So next I'll just trim the ends. I didn't want the sentiment to be as white as my panel. And I'll use some foam adhesive to adhere it onto the panel, but before that I'm just preparing my card base. This time I decided to use top folding card base, which is 4.5 by 11, scored on 5.5. So I'm just putting everything together to see how it looks. Again, I'm using fun foam, black fun foam, to adhere that, to pop that panel up. So I'm using the Tombow Extreme Adhesive to adhere the fun foam onto the panel and the card base. Next, I'm using some mounting tape to adhere to pop the sentiment up. So I think this is pretty straight. So to finish off my card, I'm using some Nuva drops, the glitter white Nuva drops, and I'm adding in the middle of each kind of created flower. So then I'll just let it dry, and with that my card will be finished. So here's a little close-up of all the cards. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for being part of Stamp Nation and following the Stamp Nation masterclasses.